on Iraq. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Iraq's ambassador to the United States. He was educated in Great Britain, a degree in electrical engineering in 1965. He also specialized in computers and computerization. He became one of the very first professionals in that area, computers that is, in Iraq. In Iraq, he worked in both the private and the public sector. Went to Europe in 1973, I believe. In 1978, he formed his own company, headquartered first in London and then in Beijing. And in 1993, returned to Iraq. During the time that he was in Europe and in China, he participated in numerous of the conferences which were held by the Iraqi opposition, including, among others, the 1992 meeting when Mr. Shalabi and others formed the National Congress, the Iraqi National Congress, and the ambassador worked on what I think is always an interesting and critical committee, that of the for the Constitution. He was appointed, he became a member of the Governing Council upon returning to Iraq. He became their Minister of Interior. He later was appointed as the new Iraq's first ambassador to the United Nations, and then became the new Iraq's first ambassador to the United States of America. A series of important assignments, and he's one of that cadre of Iraqis who are devoting much time and energy with great courage to serve the future of their country. None of us have to be reminded here of how torn we Americans are at this particular point in history. We are disappointed and often frustrated and often don't see an answer to the questions of stability, of reconciliation, of diplomacy with neighboring countries, all of which are challenges which seem almost impossible at times. But fortunately, the ambassador will discuss those things this evening. We look forward to his presentation. It's my great pleasure, which joins with a great interest, in presenting to you the Ambassador of Iraq to the United States, Ambassador Sumaida'ie.
Thank you, Dr. Burd. Thank you for this invitation and for this opportunity to address such a large and distinguished audience. Iraq is now the subject of a debate that's going on in the United States, a heartfelt debate, a sincere debate. Which way to go? American people have invested a great deal in this experiment. Some might call it adventure. And most of them express a degree of bewilderment. Why has it gone wrong? We've gone to help a people to free them from dictatorship, yet we seem to be getting a lot of problems. This evening, I'd like to help clarify some of the answers to this. But in order to create an understanding of the current situation, we need to go back. We need to look with the use of the perspective of history, both ancient history and modern history. Iraq is the oldest, or at least one of the oldest civilizations. It's the cradle of civilization. In Mesopotamia, which is the ancient name for Iraq, the wheel was invented. The week as a unit of time was first ever devised. Beer was brewed for the first time. I thought that might get some enthusiasm going. The first ever public library, the first ever written recipe, the first ever written law. Many, many other firsts, and if I were to enumerate them, I would have you here with me for a long time. Iraq was also, in addition to all this, and this might surprise you, the first ever democracy. Most Western nations think that democracy goes back to the Greeks. The word democracy, the rule of the people. In fact, a Sumerian city in Iraq was the first ever two-chamber democracy, which limited the authority of the king by a constitution. And the king had no power to declare war on other city-states or initiate major taxation without reference to both chambers. And that was more than 3,000 years ago. So people who say, don't bother about Iraq, they know nothing about democracy, they will never ever be democratic, should reflect. Yes, Iraq has descended into difficult times. It was fought over by empires over centuries. And in the modern time, after throwing off the yoke of the Ottoman Empire, we came under the domination initially, and then the influence of the British Empire in the 20th century. But as a country, we regained our vitality and we started building a vibrant society. Modern Iraq, now I'm moving into the modern era. Modern Iraq was a promising country. It was a country which was hopeful, looking to the future, and with much to commend it. When I was born in Baghdad, I was born in 1944 into a middle-class family. Not very rich, but not poor. My parents took care of my education, the education of my siblings, and most families were doing reasonably well. They took care of the education of their children. They looked after their homes, after the gardens. There was no violence. Corruption was unheard of. The country infrastructure was being built. Oil revenues were being invested wisely. The GDP in Iraq was equivalent to that of Spain. And by 1958, we had a tidy amount as our foreign reserves, something like $35 billion. For that, at that time, that was a reasonable amount to have. So what went wrong? The military took over. And very soon after that, the Ba'athists and Saddam Hussein took over and started systematically dismantling the country and looting it and oppressing its people. By the time Saddam was done and he was removed, the country was completely on its knees. Instead of $35 billion in reserves, we had $350 billion as debts or reparation claims. The Iraqi dinar, which was equivalent to 3.3 American dollars when I was a high school student, had collapsed completely. $1 was equivalent to 3,000 Iraqi dinars. The average income of a doctor or a teacher was in pennies. It was less than $10 a month. Teachers could not afford to buy meat or chicken for their families, and the country was destitute. But the destruction was not only on the economy, it was social destruction, which was compounded, by the way, by the years of sanctions. Sanctions helped to destroy the very institutions of state. And again, when Saddam was removed, more than 50% of people in employment were employed in security-related jobs. We had many, many security agencies all spying on each other and watching each other. And the average citizen had to be schizophrenic to survive, had to have one face to the outside world, another face inwards. It was a very, very dark period for our nation, which was taken into war twice, once against Iran and then against Kuwait. Young people who were conscripted into the army and kept there for years, those who survived and were not maimed, emerged with no jobs and no prospects of jobs, brutalized and traumatized. A society which was almost totally destroyed. Ethnic and sectarian tensions were high because of this ruthless and heartless period of despotism. Enter the United States. 2003, and I, for most of my life, lived in exile, like many other Iraqis, used to come to Washington, D.C., come to New York, was in London, lobbying, trying to persuade politicians to intervene, to remove Saddam Hussein, because I believed, and I still do, that he represented a danger not only to Iraq, but to the entire world. And I believed, and I still do, that the Iraqi people were so weakened that they could not possibly remove him by themselves. Effectively, he had the whole nation, those who remained in the country, in abject bondage. Before 9/11, the official policy in the United States towards Iraq and Iran was containment, dual containment. Put a lid on it, forget about it, and let it fester. Well, that changed after 9/11. 9/11 persuaded many people in this country that the United States is not safe by only keeping its internal affairs safe. It's not immune against violence, which originates abroad. And also, the old doctrine that dictatorships in other countries might be useful, might not be useful, but they do not have any impact on our life here in the United States. I think the thinking changed. And the new thinking was that democracies are safer. Democracies are more reliable. They are more likely to be reliable partners against terrorism and against violence. So, ultimately, the United States took the decision, for whatever reason or reasons, a series of reasons, to intervene after Afghanistan, and they did. In the period immediately before American intervention, there were many of us Iraqis who helped in the planning of of this intervention, not the intervention itself, but the management of the country after the intervention. And we pointed to what needs to be done and what must not be done in the aftermath of military intervention. There were working groups on a whole range of issues, from constitutional issues to the tribal issues, the economy, cultural issues. We even made recommendations on how to protect the Iraqi Museum, detailed recommendations on every single issue. But after the military campaign was completed, unfortunately, a decision was made to transfer the management of the whole country from State Department into the Pentagon, and all these reports were shelved and ignored, and we know what happened after that. A period of lawlessness ensued. In all probability, and all indications are, in fact, that not enough troops were used to maintain law and order immediately after the country was occupied. Iraq was a huge depot for armaments and munitions. A lot of it was looted. The borders were not secured, was left wide open, inviting terrorists from all over the world. So we had a period of total loss of control. All the police were disbanded, and all the army and all the other security forces were disbanded. You imagine, please, if this city, Baltimore, decided to disband the police for a month, how many of you would feel safe in the streets? Iraq, with this violent and traumatic recent past, with Saddam releasing into the streets tens of thousands of hardened criminals immediately before the American intervention. Then the police were disbanded. It's an open invitation to violence and mayhem. However, we Iraqis who were in exile went back, and we tried to fill the vacuum. We tried to get things going, and eventually had to work with our American friends to regain control. But regaining control after losing it is harder than building it something on a continual basis. And we're still trying to regain control 4 years later. Al-Qaeda took root in some areas in Iraq, and their strategy was to create a civil war, a sectarian civil war. So they started targeting Shia leaders, Shia shrines, incessantly and ruthlessly. In August 2003, they killed al-Hakim, Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim, who was the most prominent Shia leader. He was a cleric. As he was leaving the mosque on Friday prayer, they killed about 120 of his people. And that was followed immediately, very quickly afterwards, by bombing the United Nations headquarters, and it went on. By 2006, February, they built up a very high head of steam, and then bombed one of the most revered shrines in Shia religion in Samir. That created an explosion. During the first period, most Shia, especially the educated and even their religious leaders, saw through what Al-Qaeda were trying to do. And they always advised their people not to react, not to retaliate, not to get involved in violence. But there came a point where they lost control of their own people, and the violence ensued. Again, we are trying to rope that in, trying to regain control. Under fire, we still made huge progress. We managed to create a transitional constitution. When I was member of the Governing Council, we negotiated that, and for the first time in the region, we incorporated a Bill of Rights and many principles for guaranteeing freedom. Later, we had an election followed by a full constitution, the preparation of full constitution, and a referendum on the constitution, and the second round of elections, all under fire, as I said, with the threat of terrorism. We still had 70% turnout, and on the day of the election, with a lot of precautions, but still more than 40 people were murdered on that very day. And until now, we continue to bleed. Our people are suffering greatly. We try to extend services to the people, and these services are sabotaged. Our refineries are sabotaged. Our power stations are sabotaged. Pipelines, schools even. We are facing an enemy which is ruthless beyond anyone's imagination. The ruthlessness that does not discriminate between anybody, a friend or foe. This was exemplified recently by the use of 2 kids who were kidnapped and put in the back of a car to help convince security people at the checkpoint that this is a family. They went past the checkpoint. The driver then left the car and detonated it with the kids in it. This is the kind of enemy we are facing. But this enemy is not only targeting Iraq. Iraq is the current battleground, is the current front. If it is lost, it will merely be converted into a base of operation for this enemy. It will merely empower these terrorists and award them the advantage of having the second largest reserves of oil in the world. With that wealth and that territory, you can imagine the devastation they can wreak on the world. The confrontation that's taking place in Iraq is not only an Iraqi issue, it's an international issue. Already, regional powers are interfering and intervening. And as I said, it is, in a sense, a standoff between 2 ideologies. The ideology of open society, whose values are based on the value of life and liberty, and the ideology of despotism, where control and oppression are the currency. And the outcome of this confrontation will matter. They will matter to us, certainly, but they will also matter to you in the United States. So I believe you in this room and the good people of the United States beyond this room should understand what's at stake, should understand the ramifications of failure in Iraq. We are facing difficulties, but no matter how hard these difficulties are, we've got to find ways of solving them. And we've got to work together to solve them. I believe, whether for better or for worse, our destinies are linked. The destiny of the Iraqi people and that of the United States. We succeed together or fail together. We sink or swim. If we fail, it will be a huge failure for the United States, which will haunt it for generations to come. This is not Vietnam. It's different. I was conversing in the reception outside about, or maybe just a short while ago, with one of the gentlemen here, I believe it was Mr. Davis, about the Second World War. The Second World War transformed Europe into a peaceful part of the world, into part of the world which is building prosperity and adding to the stability of mankind. And it was important that the war took place, Second World War took place, because without it, this transformation would not have happened. It is a historical equivalent, I believe, in what's happening now in Iraq. The outcome of the struggle in Iraq, if it is positive, it will transform a whole region full of trouble into a stable oasis for the world, where it can become and will become an engine for growth and development. And if it fails, it will be forever a source of trouble. And we are at the crossroads. So all the debate that rages in Washington, all the politics that are played, and everybody is accusing everybody about everything, that game, it's not my business to interfere in it. It's for American politicians. We respect it, it's a part of democracy, and fine. But at the end of the day, both sides have to weigh up the national interest, the American national interest. And I believe whoever sits in that Oval Office will have on his shoulder the responsibility of securing the interests of the United States. And it doesn't matter whether that person is going to be Republican or Democrat or whatever. That responsibility will dictate certain choices. I believe the only choice for Iraq is to ensure that it will not fall into the hands of the terrorists. Iraqis are fighting bravely, they are dying, and they are not about to give up. And the Americans might walk out, but the Iraqis cannot all walk out. This is their country. Their chances would be reasonably good if they continue to have support of not only the United States, but also at least some of their neighbors. Their chances would be diminished considerably if they are abandoned. Next month, well, next few days, on the 3rd and 4th, there will be 2 important conferences in Sharm el-Sheikh to debate the Iraqi issue, and hopefully they will come out with some positive signals. Iraq has now become a source of worry, but also a source of interest. We stand at a crossroads. And as I said, and at the risk of repeating myself, the outcome is extremely important to each one of you and each one of us. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, we thank you for such a well-reasoned, eloquent, and powerful presentation. There are 2 microphones, each in the aisle. If you ask a question from the floor, I'll repeat it, but if you're at the aisle, the ambassador can hear you, the cameras can record it. Our rules of procedure, as you know, are very simple. No statements and succinct questions in order to maximize the number of people who have an opportunity to ask questions, and we get more answers from the ambassador that way. The gentleman in the green shirt was the first, I believe. Sir.
You stated that after the invasion, mistakes were made and we lost control of the society and created anarchy. The solution that the current administration is using is basically the same with more people, the surge. Okay? We are unwilling to make the commitment of more troops in the beginning, and we're unwilling to make a commitment. We haven't declared war, we have no taxation, we're funding this on debt. Why should anything be different now than it was 4 years ago?
Thank you, sir. This is an important question. I believe there are a number of reasons why things are different now. First, we've both learned from mistakes. I think the American administration has learned a great deal during the last 4 years. I think it was Winston Churchill who once said, Americans always end up doing the right thing after exhausting the alternatives. Well, they just about exhausted the alternatives. So that's factor number 1. They have learned a great deal. This surge is not just an increase in numbers. I am in touch with General David Petraeus. In fact, last Friday we had dinner together. And before he left, after he was confirmed, I had a long meeting with him. I worked with him closely when I was Minister of Interior. There is a change of mission. Before this new plan, the modus operandi of the armed forces was force protection. In other words, it was a defensive posture. Priority was to protect the troops. Now the mission is provide security. So the emphasis has shifted from a defensive posture to a posture which actually is aimed to provide security for communities. And only when we provide security jointly, we can create an atmosphere in which people can work and function, and the government can function, and politics can function. The third difference is that now, for the first time, all operations are Iraqi-led. Iraqis go first with support from the Americans. Because we've reached that point where we can use our armed forces in that way. They're not yet strong enough to be on their own totally. So for these 3 reasons, I believe we are now in different territory, and we have a chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You're a brave man, and so are all the Iraqis who are trying to reconstruct their country. I'm sure you're aware that Americans are divided on this whole issue. And in the upcoming elections, no matter who wins, the taste for the American people is that there will be no more war. And I think most agree that it was probably unwise to try to occupy an entire Arab nation in light of Khobar Towers and other things. What do you think will happen after this next American elections?
Dr. Burd, do you supply a crystal ball here? I will try to address the first part of the question at least. Nobody likes war. War is an evil, evil thing. But if it's thrust upon you, you have to defend yourself. There are evil forces in this world, unfortunately. They have a habit of visiting innocent people. And I believe that innocent people must have the right to fight back. This is where we are. In terms of occupation, I'm glad you raised this point, sir, because that is, in fact, one of the mistakes that were made. We welcomed the Americans as liberators, not as occupiers. Unfortunately, on the advice of some lawyers, I apologize for any lawyers here, it was characterized in Security Council Resolution 1483 as an occupation. That is to give some kind of legal basis for the absolute rule by Jerry Bremer. That was a mistake, because that immediately cast us as collaborators and cast the terrorists in the guise of resistance fighters, patriots, and helped them to recruit young people who were brought up on the idea of the sanctity of independence. It was a mistake, and I think later it was recognized as such. However, the debate does go on. People in the United States are feeling exhausted and frustrated by the lack of success and progress. They switch on their television and they see violence and destruction, but they don't see the young children who go to school. They don't see the fact that teachers who used to get $10 a month are getting $400 a month and managing to feed their families. They don't see the fact that Iraqis, for the first time in generations, well, since the 60s, they have access to the outside world. They can travel. They can have a dish on the roof of their house and watch any channel in the world they want. It was banned during Saddam Hussein. They have mobile telephone, in fact, and they had none during Saddam's time. Iraq has come out into the world. People are free. They have numerous newspapers and their own media channels. People don't see these things. They just see the incessant destruction and violence. There's a whole part of Iraq, in fact, 2/3 of Iraq, where construction is going on at breakneck rate, and investment is flowing in, where people are working hard to build. There's an opera house going up in Sumaida'ie in the north. There is progress, but it is below the radar. What will happen in the United States after the next elections, I believe that whoever wins it will consider carefully and will distance himself from the extremes of the debate that are taking place now, and will continue to support Iraq until we are both rid of the terrorist threat.
As we know, for the last couple of years, the relationship between Mr. al-Maliki and Muqtada al-Sadr has been quite close, cozy, sort of given him left him alone. Apparently, the word is out that this is no longer the case, although there hasn't been a great deal of evidence about it. What is the actual relationship today between al-Maliki and al-Sadr, and what is it going to be, and is it important?
Yes, sir, it is important. And it is important what the Iraqi Prime Minister says and does, and how he relates to other people in the country. It was very clear to us and to the Americans and to all our friends that unless the government of Iraq, adopts an even-handed approach to security, we're not going to get the sectarian violence down. The security forces have to enjoy the trust of all communities. Now, one of the clear signals that had to be given out is that anybody who breaks the law will have no quarter. That message was given out by Prime Minister Maliki loud and clear and was acted upon. And the instructions to the leader of this new security plan were on that basis. And they started acting on it. As a result, the Al-Sadr Jaysh al-Mahdi, which is effectively a sectarian militia, almost vanished. They dissolved themselves. I don't know whether they dissolved themselves, but they were not prominent in the streets as they were before. Al-Sadr himself went underground, and we don't know whether he's in Iraq or Iran or anywhere else. But that doesn't matter. The important thing for us is to make the Iraqi citizens in Baghdad feel safe. And they cannot feel safe when there are truckloads of armed young men roaming in the streets. So al-Maliki has made a policy, if you like, statement, and has demonstrated that he's sticking to it. And that is encouraging. That's positive. And that indeed was a condition laid down by the American government for continued support. But it happens to be also very much in the interest of us Iraqis.
I don't see how there will ever be peace in the Middle East or how America will ever be free from terrorist threats until the U.S. occupation of Iraq is ended and the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian is ended. Your comments, please.
Thank you. I simply don't accept that the two situations are identical. I insist that the presence of the United States in Iraq is not an occupation, and my reasons are as follows. When I was at the United Nations, before coming down to Washington, I was the Iraq permanent representative. I, with my own hand, delivered a letter from Iraq's Prime Minister to the President of the Security Council requesting, and this is an elected Iraqi government, so it has the mandate and the power to represent the people. It was a letter addressed to the President of the Security Council requesting the continued presence of the multinational force. A resolution was passed, 1637, I beg your pardon, which stated that the Security Council approves this extension subject to the wishes of the Iraqi government. So the Iraqi government at any time can call for the multinational forces to withdraw, and they would be obliged to withdraw. That is not an occupation. It is a completely different situation. Describe it however you wish. It's not an occupation. I don't want to go into the situation in Israel. That's an entirely different situation with a different history. I disagree also with this parallel because in Iraq, if the United States and its allies withdraw tomorrow, Iraq, as it stands, would be dismembered by forces which are of greater power, and the results would be catastrophic for the United States.
Thank you very much for your candid lecture. We've been told that the number of people killed in Iraq are 60,000 by some and over 300,000. My question to you, where does that lie? Does it lie closer to 60,000 or closer to 300,000? And the second part of that is the number of Iraqis who have left the country. Can you estimate that? And then are any of them coming back?
Are you referring to civilian
Yes,
casualties? Yes.
Civilians.
There is no doubt at all that civilian casualties in Iraq are horrific, are very large in numbers. There are no reliable and accurate figures that I can quote confidently. But I believe we're talking in large numbers in any case. Any loss of life, an individual life, one person, one soldier, one civilian, is always a tragedy. A family is devastated. We have now hundreds of thousands of widows and orphans. The social impact is not only during the week of the loss or the month following. It lasts for a lifetime. For kids, it lasts for a long time. So the losses are considerable and severe. Most of them, and I repeat here again my statements before, the prime source of this mass murder is the terrorists, it's Al-Qaeda, and those people who allied themselves with it. All the other, there is some sectarian killing, but it is in a sense a reaction to it. If we can deal with the prime source, we can deal with the others, and we are dealing with the others. So the second part of your question is,
how many have left the country,
yeah.
and
Yes,
are any of them coming back?
that is important. I'd like to make a brief comment here about the sectarian violence. The dynamic, Iraq has always, for millennia, has always been a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Pluralism is the essence of Iraqi society. I grew up with children of, some of them were Christian, some of them were Jewish. We grew up together and we didn't ask. However, now we have a different sort of situation. Extremists have hijacked the agenda. Extremist Sunnis in the form of Al-Qaeda started killing innocent Shia indiscriminately, which elicited a reaction from extremist Shia who started killing Sunnis on identity. If they identify this as to be a Sunni, they will murder him. So in a sense, we became, the population became hostage to the extremists on both sides. This is not a civil war. A typical civil war is when two communities fight each other. I'll give you some typical examples. A Sunni or Shia family gets a threat, a slip under the door. You will leave this neighborhood or you will be killed. We give you 24 hours. Most people take the safe option. They have to pick up and go. In most cases, if not all cases, they leave the keys to their house with their neighbors who are of a different sect, because they're their neighbors. They've lived with them all their lives. This is Iraqi society, but the threat is potent. They still leave their house. And as a result of this threat by extremists on both sides, we have hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, who have left the country entirely, certainly have left their homes. And as I was speaking to General Petraeus last Friday, I said to him, what I am going to watch out for is how many families go back to their homes. That's, if you like, the canary in the shaft, as far as I'm concerned. That will be the indicator which will be most eloquent in telling me whether we are succeeding or we are not. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I was very pleased to read in the New York Times about the progress in the Anbar province with the security cooperation going there. What I wanted to ask you about was how are the comments of Harry Reid received in country, and is there enough presence, in your opinion, media outlets that are saying your position, vice how the enemy might try to get their point across?
Thank you. To be fair and honest, I think this was a slip of the tongue. I'm sure the distinguished senator regrets it, even if he doesn't say so. Let's take a charitable interpretation. We in Iraq certainly don't believe the war is lost. We will never accept that.
Mr. Ambassador, in your presentation, you asserted that Al-Qaeda is active and promoting much of the violence that racks your country right now. that is a now widely discredited justification for the war originally. How would you defend that as an assertion that American interests are still at risk because of terrorism from al-Qaeda and other forces?
What I said is really a statement of fact, sir. Now, the situation now, that is as I described it. The major threat in Iraq right now, the prime threat in Iraq is al-Qaeda. And then comes foreign interference and support and all that kind of things. The fact that this was used as a justification for the war, to some extent, is irrelevant now. It was relevant to the debate then. It is still relevant in the debate about accountability for decisions which were made. But it's not relevant to the facts on the ground now. Now, al-Qaeda holds sway in areas in Iraq, and they are creating the violence that we witness every day, together with other elements that support them. The Saddamists, for example, if I just give you, again, a hint of what we are up against. The Ba'ath Party came to power in February 1963. It was driven out of power in November of the same year, only to come back in 1968. Now, they vowed when they were out of power that if they ever come back, they would never they would never relinquish power, and if they ever were driven out of power, they would be well prepared. Saddam Hussein put aside 5% of the revenue of oil for a return to power fund. So that built up billions. The last count was 14 billion at that time. This is managed like any good mafia through legitimate companies, and for all that I know, some of the businesses even in the city might have money from that kind of fund. These resources were mobilized after Saddam was removed by the Saddamists to fund so-called resistance. In other words, to try and fund their attempt to come back to power. Saddam also sent his son, Qusay, to the Central Bank of Iraq 2 weeks before they were removed to load up $1.9 billion in cash. So we're talking about a very well-funded enemy here, al-Qaeda and the Saddamists together. In a country where there is no employment, they can hire young people at $100 a month. You know, give them a Kalashnikov and let them loose. This is the situation we have. Whether the United States went into Iraq because of al-Qaeda or not, frankly, that's now not the issue.
We have come to frame the story of Iraq in terms of Sunni Islam and Shia Islam as if we suddenly learned something. Can you kindly tell us, during the era of Ba'athist power, if we had eavesdropped on households in Baghdad, mixed Sunni Shia, or maybe more so Shia only, can you tell us, were there learnings and myths and beliefs and core values that were held in those households that help us to understand the situation in Iraq today?
That calls for another lecture. But since we are just winding up, let me say that Saddam Hussein did use sectarian discrimination as a weapon of power, as an instrument of power. But he used it in a structured way. And the structure was very simple. He discriminated against his cousins in favor of his sons, and against his townsmen in favor of his family, and against other towns in favor of his town. And the pyramid grew ever wider as you get farther and farther away from the center of absolute power, which is himself. Now, as a result, because Saddam was Sunni from a particular locality, the Shia were discriminated against because they were just farther apart, farther away. That is the nature of the discrimination. Shia theology is based on a sense of grievance, which goes back to historical times. So they are much more sensitive to being discriminated against, if you like, because it is part of their psychological makeup. And they respond by anger. Saddam's period fed that, unfortunately. The more educated segments of Shiites understand, and they see through this, especially the secular Shia. And there are a lot of secular Shia. Iraq was broadly a secular country in the 50s and 60s. In fact, during a long period, but this religious revival took place more recently. There is, however, as I said, there is no enmity between Sunni and Shia. There are differences, but there is no natural enmity. In my own embassy, I have a team made up of Sunnis and Shias, and we don't even. In fact, I have members in my embassy that I don't know whether they are Sunni and Shia, and I don't want to know. And this is the way we work. This has been amplified. To some extent, the amplification took place in this country because people want to have simple designations, have labels. They are used to think in labels. But this doesn't apply really to Iraq to the extent that you think. Thank you very much.